When the door slammed shut for the last time, Margaret realized her own daughter had just signed her death warrant. Not metaphorically, not in a fit of rage, but officially with a pen on paper, in broad daylight, in a lawyer's office, with 2 witnesses and a notary seal. The ward is no longer capable of making decisions, her daughter read aloud, without looking at her. All property and medical authority are transferred to me, Emily Carter. Margaret stood by the window, gripping her cane so tightly her knuckles turned white. She was 72. Her hands shook, not from illness, but from fury. She could still walk, cook, drive, and had even won a property line dispute against a neighbor just 3 months earlier. But now, on paper, she was incapacitated. A word that made her stomach churn. "You think I wouldn't notice?" she whispered as her daughter gathered the papers into a folder. "You think I'll just sit in my chair and wait for you to bury me?" Emily finally looked at her. There was no hatred in her eyes. No pity either. Only exhaustion, the kind that comes from believing bone deep that you're right. "Mom, you need care. You're forgetting things. You get lost." "I don't get lost," Margaret interrupted. "I just finally see you. Truly, for the first time in years." Emily left, abandoning her in the house Margaret had built with her husband 40 years ago, brick by brick, dream by dream. Now that house had become a cage. And her daughter, its jailer. But Margaret knew one thing. In their family, revenge never began with shouting. It began with silence. 9 months earlier, everything had seemed different. Emily had come for Thanksgiving with her husband and 2 children. Margaret baked a pumpkin pie using her mother's recipe. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon, apples, and hope. Emily laughed, telling stories about how her eldest got into college and how her youngest was obsessed with horses. Margaret hung on every word as if they were her last. She didn't know then that Emily had already been eyeing her house for weeks. Didn't know her daughter had been discussing what to do about Mom with her brother, as if Margaret weren't a person, but a problem to be solved. Her brother, Jason. He'd always been quiet. Since childhood, he'd hidden behind his sister, letting her decide for him. Yet it was he who first mentioned the power of attorney. He who found the lawyer. And Emily who simply signed elegantly, confidently, as if endorsing a charity check. "She's our mother," Jason had said once over the phone, when Margaret had just begun suspecting something was wrong. "She just can't manage alone anymore. We're looking out for her." Margaret said nothing. That evening, she reread her will for the first time in years. Everything she and her husband had built, the house, the savings, the antique clock he'd brought back from Europe after the war, was to be split equally between her children. But only on one condition, that they maintain respect and care for her until her final days. She didn't know it then, but those words would become her final weapon. After the notary's office, Margaret stopped arguing, stopped explaining, even stopped leaving the house. She became the good mother, quiet, obedient, forgetful. She wore old-fashioned dresses, mixed up the days of the week, accidentally dropped cups. Emily visited once a week, brought groceries, checked the bills, took away her car keys, just in case. "You're doing great, Mom," she'd say, patting her shoulder like she was a child. "Everything will work out soon." Soon meant once you're gone. But Margaret had no intention of disappearing. She was waiting. She waited for her daughter to bring the grandchildren. Waited for Jason to come asking about finances. Waited for them both to sign the papers consenting to her voluntary transfer to a retirement home. And one day, she got her chance. It was a Tuesday. Rainy. Gray. Emily and Jason sat in the kitchen, discussing the move. Margaret sat in the living room, pretending to nap. In reality, she was recording every word on a voice recorder hidden inside an old book. "The key is not to drag it out," Jason said. "The house is worth a lot on the market right now. We sell, split the money, and we've got a safety net." "And her?" Emily asked. "Sand Lake has great care. They even have a pool. She'll like it." Margaret barely stifled a laugh. Sand Lake, a private care facility 3 hours away. That's where you sent parents when you didn't want to see them every day. That's where you sent them to be forgotten. She waited until they left. Then she got up, washed the cups they'd left behind, and sat at the table. In front of her lay an envelope she'd prepared a week earlier. Inside, a copy of her will, the audio recording, and a letter to her attorney. She knew, if she sued now, her children would simply claim she was mentally unstable. Her words would carry no weight. But if she waited until they signed the property transfer documents themselves, then she'd have a weapon. And that weapon was their greed. 2 weeks later, Emily returned, not with groceries, but with forms. "Mom, we need you to sign this. It's just for your own safety." Margaret put on her glasses, slowly traced her finger along the lines as if struggling to read. Inside, she was boiling, but her face remained calm. "This house, is it being sold?" "Only if you want," Emily lied. "It's temporary. While you're at Sand Lake." Margaret nodded, took the pen, signed. Emily left with the papers, glowing with relief. She didn't notice how her mother, watching her drive away, pulled a second copy of the will from her jewelry box, the one notarized in front of 3 neighbors and a retired judge. The trial began a month later. Margaret arrived in the brown suit she'd worn to her husband's funeral. Her hair was neatly styled, her hands steady. She spoke clearly, firmly, without a single tear. Her lawyer played the audio. Jason's voice, "The key is not to drag it out." "Emily's, and her?" The judge frowned. "You're claiming your children tried to declare you incompetent, not out of concern, but for your assets?" "I'm claiming they used my love as a weakness," Margaret replied. "Now I'm using their greed as proof." Emily sat pale in the courtroom. Jason didn't show up. The court ruled, the will stood. The power of attorney was void. All attempted asset transfers invalid. But Margaret didn't stop there. A week later, she filed a lawsuit for emotional distress. Not for money, but so everyone who walked into that courtroom would know she couldn't be erased. A year passed. The house still stood on the hill, surrounded by maples. Margaret planted new roses, red like rage and yellow like forgiven pain. Emily called once a month. Her voice was polite, cold. Margaret kept her answers brief. Jason sent Christmas cards. She hired a caregiver, not out of fear, but by choice. A woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and patience. She didn't pry, didn't ask unnecessary questions. Just made soup, read the newspaper aloud, and sometimes sat with Margaret on the porch, watching the sunset in silence. One day, Margaret asked, "Are you afraid of growing old?" The caregiver smiled. "I'm afraid of being forgotten, not of growing old." Margaret nodded. She understood. She no longer waited for her children to return with apologies. Didn't expect hugs, tears, or deathbed reconciliations. That happened on TV, rarely in real life. But she didn't regret it. Because revenge isn't a scream. It isn't a punch. It isn't a shattered vase or burned photographs. Revenge is staying alive, holding on to what you built, looking into the eyes of those who tried to erase you and saying, "I'm still here." And that was enough.